I appreciate that. 13 minutes after 5. Keith Wallahan joins us. He is the federal Liberal MP for the seat of Menzies right here in Melbourne. Good afternoon, Keith. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Raf, and good afternoon to your listeners.
We heard the Shadow Treasurer speaking there. Why does the Coalition say it's a broken promise?
We had a federal election in May last year, and the message we all heard loud and clear that one of the top issues was integrity. And there's no more important example of integrity than sticking to your promises. There were key promises made by the Albanese then opposition, which people relied upon, and they relied upon when they casted their vote, and superannuation was one of them. So to throw a kite up about a conversation for changes should be concerning to the electorate, particularly when we saw the promises that were made about energy and reducing bills by $275, and we know what happened to that promise.
But all governments say they're not going to touch super, and then they're forced by necessity to change things. 9 years of coalition, there were plenty of super changes, and we were told they wouldn't happen.
Well, I don't accept that cynical view of politics, and maybe because I'm a first-termer, that happens with age, Raf. But I like to think when people make a commitment, they stick to it. So people relied upon that commitment. And with financial planning advice, people think about the long term. And for years and years, people rely upon what they're told. And then when the rules change, it becomes an area that people can't trust anymore. And that's not good for our economy or for people's security when they age.
I'm all for, I guess, open-minded and positivity and not being cynical, Keith Wallahan. I genuinely am. But Tony Abbott delayed the superannuation guarantee, which was talked about a lot. Didn't happen again, but it did happen once with you guys. When he was Treasurer, Scott Morrison changed the super details for your $1.6 million, the balance cap. That's like it's all there on the Treasury website. I can keep going. During the pandemic, people could access super in ways that you didn't talk about before the election. The Prime Minister, when he was Prime Minister, Scott Morrison spoke about using super to, for your home. The Coalition's done this a lot, said we're not going to change super, but here's something on the margins that we need to do. How is that any different to Labor talking about this today?
Well, that's classic whataboutism. And, I could take up the rest of this interview discussing and defending parts of those, including the context of the pandemic. But let's talk about this change. On the one hand, the government is saying that, the expenses and the tax concessions are at 53 billion, and that's only a couple of billion short of the age pension. So I understand that argument that's being put, but then we also see them say, well, this will only be limited to savings of 3 million or more. And as you pointed out, that's only 36,000 people and would lead to a saving of 1 billion. So either this is an important conversation to have that will lead to real savings, or this is just a headline that's being used to stoke envy against people in the community. I don't think it's a serious conversation, but it presents a serious concern about whether you can trust the Labor Party and their promises.
If I can just address, when you say it's whataboutism, can I go through that again? If a government says, look, we've got to delay the superannuation guarantee because the budget's in a terrible shape, which is what happened in 2014. When Scott Morrison changed things in 16-17 as Treasurer, they were in fact, it says on the website, this measure will not affect the vast majority of Australians. It will, in fact, affect less than 1% of fund members. I mean, how is this any different? Tell me why you actually think this is different to what the Coalition did for 9 years.
Well, the core change that the Coalition did was to introduce more transparency and integrity. And that should be a commitment for any government or opposition at any time. I don't
change the tax arrangements. It wasn't just transparency.
Well, that was the key part about the change. The key part was about people knowing what was happening to their funds, and it was more transparent. And it was about looking after the interests of the members rather than the interests of the super fund managers.
Can I ask you to address this as a member of Peter Dutton's team? Keith Wallahan's with us. He's one of the Melbourne Liberal MPs. Can I ask you to address Keith Russ, who's texted from Pascoe? Anyone with over $5 million in super complaining they're losing tax concessions is pure greed. What do you think?
Well, I mean that you don't know the circumstances of any particular person, but let's imagine someone had multiple generation family business and they've decided to exit that business, and they went to their financial planner and said, what should I do with it? And this was the advice they were given. We don't know the context of that. We don't know how many children and grandchildren that they want to set up in other businesses. We don't know the context of it. And I just don't think that's a healthy area to go for in our social discourse. We don't know what circumstances exist for each individual, but we do know people are entitled to rely upon the laws that we have. So any possible retrospective activity of something is just unfair, and I don't think the politics of envy helps that.
Just before I let you go, Keith Wallahan, the Aston by-election is almost your part of the world. I'm going to try and force you into a one-only thing. What's going to be the single biggest issue that will decide the Aston by-election? If I think superannuation, inflation, voice, anything else, if you had to pick one thing, what do you think will be the biggest issue in Aston?
I'm going to get in trouble with you, Ralph. I'm going to pick two. I think the first is mortgage stress. 30% of households in Aston, 16% of households in Aston are suffering mortgage stress, which means that more than 30% of your income has been spent on mortgage repayments. And we haven't seen the bottom of the current interest rate rises. So that's a real issue there. And the other one is, again, it comes back to promises by the Labor Party. There were several road and transport infrastructure promises that were cut, and I'm sure they'll be flipped in the next few weeks. But I think people need to ask whether you can trust the Labor Party.
Although they didn't promise those road projects, you did.
Well, we did, but then they were cut. And so they were projects that were...
But they're technically not broken promises because they didn't promise to do it. You guys did. I'm not saying they're not cuts, but they didn't promise to do it.
Well, I'll give you that, Raf. But if in the next few weeks we suddenly see them as commitments, then we'll have to ask whether the Labor Party truly believes that they're needed in the area.
Yes, I was thinking of asking the Infrastructure Minister if there might be that change. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Keith Wallahan's the federal Liberal MP for the seat of Menzies, which is almost that part of the world where there's going to be an electorate up for grabs. The Aston by-election is at the start.